Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Adam, Content Marketing Specialist with Schein, and I'll be your moderator. There will be no live Q&A concluding tonight's presentation. If you have questions pertaining to the topic, please email us at ppt@henryschein.com. Please make sure that your volume is up and any large applications are closed on your viewing device to ensure a smooth connection. This webinar is presented by Henry Schein Dental Business Institute, and no CE credits are being offered. Our speaker today is Dr. Thomas Snyder. Dr. Snyder is the Senior Director of Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions. Dr. Snyder, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for another Dental Business Institute webinar program. Some of you may have attended a few that I gave earlier this summer, one in May and one in June. Ironically, this program was going to be broadcast back in the spring. And obviously, because of the closures around the country, we thought it would not be appropriate to have this presentation, but wait to a good time. And I think with the information I'll be sharing with you in a few minutes, you'll see why we are good to go with presenting this topic today. So tonight, what we're going to look at is, first of all, give you an update on where we stand right now in the dental marketplace, understand long and short-term planning for an associate, learn how to develop a profitable associate relationship, learn various ways to compensate an associate, understand the key components of an associate agreement, and review the impact of an associate on a practice's value. So I want to give you a recap of where we are since the pandemic has had a big impact on the entire country, and specifically our dental economy. The American Dental Association Health Policy Institute has initiated a study which began in March, and they call it a wave. Every 2 weeks, they provided a webinar tracking thousands of dentists in private practice, specialty, and general, of course, all age groups, about the impact of COVID on their dental practice. So I'm just going to cover a few points right now. Actually, I attended a webinar as recently as yesterday, which gave us updated information. So it's hot off the press. As of August 10th, capacity in dental practices has been decreased by 25%. Actually, about a month ago, they asked dentists, how many patients could you treat per day pre-COVID? How many patients can you treat per day post-COVID? So for those practitioners who were open and treating patients for regular services, the majority said that they encountered about a 25% decrease in the number of patients that they could treat optimally. So that means a 25% decrease in capacity. Obviously, that has implications because many of you know how difficult it is. You can't have the same volume with all the PPE requirements. Patient volume is now at 73% of pre-COVID levels. So basically, we're the capacity at 25% and the 73% of patient volume kind of are correlated. What it means is we have a new normal where some of you may be as busy as you were pre-COVID, but many are not. The good news is with our patients that 72% of adults are very comfortable visiting the dentist. They consider it a safe environment. And so that's really helped our dental practices rebound after they were closed. 40% of the dental offices reported on average that they are open with business as usual compared to pre-COVID. So that's an extremely strong statistic. And another 51% were open on average, but with lower patient volumes. So the bottom line is our dental profession has done pretty darn well. Solo practitioners, though, have a higher proportion of lower patient volume as compared to doctors in groups. Staffing issues. Well, we found that there are some staffing issues with hygienists, and this is going to have an implication on when I talk about associates and integrating them into your practice. That's been the employment group that We had some retirements of hygienists. Others decided that because of childcare requirements, they had to give up their part-time jobs. So we have some significant issues with hygienists. As far as associates about 2 months ago were really in trouble. Uh, the majority of associates were not being paid. We had lots of associates on unemployment, but I'm happy to report as of August 10th that 75% of associates are being fully paid. Another 21%, however, are being partially paid, which means they're not quite where they'd like to be. They could use more work. They could find another job, work part-time. And unfortunately, about 4% of associates are not being paid at all, and about half of them are still on unemployment. But I must confess, looking at these numbers since March, this picture has turned around dramatically. So that's a good thing for sure. Now we have some marketplace realities, which for many of you, if you've never had an associate, this is going to be significant as far as the planning for an associate. You probably read in the literature that less than 50% of dental practices are considered solo, working by yourself. When I graduated from dental school, it was about 90% of dentists desired to be a solo practitioner because we wanted to work on our own, wanted to control our own destiny. But over time, things have changed. Generations have changed. And most younger doctors prefer to work with someone else. And this is underscored by this statistic from the American Dental Association. Only 1 in 5 dentists under the age of 35 want to be a solo practitioner. So that may have some implications for you solo doctors who are looking to bring in an associate with the hope that maybe you'll sell them your practice. There aren't as many candidates for that particular model. So that is some concern, but you should at least be aware of it. Corporate dental groups continue to compete for associates, and that's a big deal because if you're a solo practitioner and want to bring in an associate, you've got to pay them, and we're going to talk about that tonight and how to pay them and what to pay them. But suffice it to say, we compete against larger groups. It's obvious they have the economic power to do things that most solo practitioners can't without some financial sacrifice. Another important statistic for long-term planning, particularly, is that dentist practice ownership is in decline. In 2005, 84.2% of dentists were owners. 2017, 77.5% are owners. So we're seeing an increase in doctors who would like to work all the time as an associate. So we'll talk about that tonight as well. I wanted to share this statistic with you only because it gives you some metric to look toward when we talk about how and when should you bring an associate in and at what dollar level must you be performing. So to give you a frame of reference, this came from the Survey of Dental Practice from the American Dental Association 2019, that on average, solo GPs average $755,000 in gross billings per year. Solo specialists average $1,088,000 in gross billings per year. So that kind of gives us a little bit of a background of where we are post-COVID, what are some of the issues that we face, which will help those of you who are thinking of an associate to maybe do some critical thinking about your plans. So let's take a look now at your future associate, where they're coming from, what they're thinking, what kind of debt they have. So right here, we see this graph that if you go on the left in 2010, we had the majority of dental graduates at about a little less than 5,000, but you'll notice that only about 1,200 dentists were retiring in 2010. And I think all of you can recognize why that is so, because the impact of the Great Recession was finally hitting us and hitting us hard. So doctors who had desired to retire back in 2010 could no longer afford to because they lost significant amount of retirement assets. So it's taken years for them to get back to normal. In addition to which, those doctors who might have been 65 back in 2010. Fast forward to where we are now in their mid 70s. So we're beginning to see the trends change, even though the number of dental graduates has increased slightly. And if we jump to the far right, this is a prediction. This is not fact because it's 2020. But we know we're graduating about 6,300 dentists. And based on the number of dentists who retired in 2018, which was about 4,800, uh, we're predicting that probably around 6,000 dentists will retire this year. And that's mainly due not only to the fact they're older, but it's because of COVID. We've seen a growing number of doctors who were solos decided not to go back to work, deciding to sell their practice, some in a very expeditious manner and just taking their best offer. Now, those numbers could be conservative. We may have the first crossover year at the end of 2020 where that dark blue bar is going to exceed the light blue bar, meaning we may even have more than 6,000 dentists retiring in 2020. So we'll have to see, but that's just kind of one of the few times I do a prediction. But we'll see how the numbers look in 2021. Now let's take a look at the class of 2019. And throughout the years, as I've lectured on this topic, and those of you who may have heard me speak on this a year or two ago, we use a survey that's conducted every year by the American Dental Education Association. And what they're doing is tracking the graduates, asking them lots of questions. What do you plan to do? Where are you going to go? You're going to graduate school? You're going to go to GPR? And so if we look at the class of 2019, we see that there's an orange bar and kind of a golden bar on the second line. And we see more doctors going into residencies and internships. Back in 2016, there was about 34%. This year, it's up about 36%. Interestingly enough, if we look at the number of dentists who stated they wanted to go into private practice, 51% said yes, 48% said yes for 2019. Again, in 2016, it was about 51%. So when we broke down the number of dentists who said they wanted to go into private practice, a very interesting statistic. If you look where it says intended private practice type for new dental school graduates, you'll see that in 2016, 42% wanted to work as an associate in an existing private practice, whereas in 2019, almost 59% wanted to become an associate in a private practice. And we also note in the second line that about 14.5% of the 2016 grads wanted to work in a DSO, and in 2019, about 18.1. However, given the economic situation, those numbers may not be totally accurate because remember, this is what they're planning to do. We're probably seeing even more of our graduates work in large groups and DSOs, but this is really from the standpoint of what they're trying to accomplish. Now, here's the depressing part of the conversation, the dental school educational debt. We all know how high it's been. For those of you have nephews, nieces, or children in dental school, you know the kind of investment you've had to make to get them through their dental education. But there are some interesting trends if you look at it. You'll see on the left, about 17% had no debt at all. 19% less than, 19% less than $200,000. But the red semicircle, so to speak, 39% have debt in excess of 300,000. So sum it all, students with debt are averaging $292,000. So the numbers keep going up. I don't see them going down. So that's a reality that we have to deal with. So when you're recruiting your first associate, when they say, I need to make $100,000 for me to pay my bills, that includes their student loans, they're not going out to lease a Porsche. They really need some heavy dollars, particularly if they're that group that's in that 39% of over $300,000. On the bright side, dental lenders know this market. They they look at the same statistics as we do. They know that their future customers are in heavy duty debt. So they're not afraid to loan money as long as the practice that they're loaning money to is profitable. And in some cases, if it's a practice sale, will the owner remain for a while? They'll look at production records of the young doctor. And more importantly, they will look at their credit history and in some cases look to see if they have some personal savings. So that's just the landscape of where we are. But that's is a context point when these doctors ask you for the kind of money that they need to survive. A couple of other important points. Uh, with our new generation of dental graduates, and this is really for the last good number of years, that many recent grads still desire to practice in urban and suburban areas. Uh, and that makes it difficult for those in the small towns and rural areas. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, most of the grads need a base of $100,000 and $150,000. The rural areas and small towns, as you can understand, are still struggling to find associates, and that is a major problem. And of course, when we talked at our last program about practice values, it makes a lot of sense why practice values in urban suburban areas are always higher than practices in small towns and rural areas because of supply and demand. So let's talk a little bit about creating value with your associate. I want to address this topic in terms of three looks. In terms of your plans, is your plan to have some type of a transition in less than 3 years? Uh, and talking to many doctors, older doctors particularly, a number of doctors have come to us and said, I was thinking of retiring in 2 or 3 years, but because of COVID, because of all the PPE requirements and everything else under the sun, I'd like to get out sooner than later. Maybe not tomorrow, but get me out with a fair price within a year or so, and I'll be really happy. So we see more doctors with a shorter timeline than we did pre COVID. So that has an implication that most of those doctors want to sell. We have another group of doctors that could be in mid-career, could be in later stage career, but for whatever reason they still want to stay in practice, but they don't want to retire for another 5 to 10 years. So the associate you may be looking for is going to be more of a long-term player, whereas in the sale it's obvious you bring someone in, they work for 1 or 2 years, you sell them the practice, and you're gone, or maybe you work part-time or not at all. And finally, we have a number of practitioners, and this is really addressed to more the younger practitioners who've been very successful, the 30 and 40 somethings particularly, who've done well, maybe did a startup, picked a good location. They need more doctors, and particularly if they're into multiple doctor ownership, they may not be so interested in equity transfer in the short run, but they may just want to have other doctors and have them be successful. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So when I look at associate tracks, I break them into three categories. What I call the employee track, where the associate who you recruit, there are no aspirations on your part or their part for them to become an owner. Maybe at some point in the distant future, but reality is you just need a good clinician, someone who's going to take care of your patients. So when you recruit someone like that, what becomes really important is retaining them, because what you don't want is a revolving door if you're just looking for employee type associates. So how you recruit them, how you take care of them, compensate them, motivate them, have them even grow better professionally through additional clinical training, those things become really important in my opinion, because if you're going to have long-term employees, you don't want to have to go back to the well and constantly recruit new doctors. That creates turnover, and as those of you who have done it before, it's it, it's costly. Now, another track for associate is a partner track, where basically you find a candidate, they're not ready for prime time, they're good people, maybe they are in your hometown. We see a lot of that too. or they may have been, in some cases, former patients. But you're not ready to give up control, and maybe they're younger, maybe they're just out of school a year or two, so they need some grooming, they need some training, mentoring, and so we may have to create something where they need to reach certain goals. Then, of course, is the issue of practice values, which we'll address shortly. And finally, the practice sale track. That's the doctor who's got a short term leash, so to speak, on their associateship because they're going to end up as an owner, whether buying a solo practitioner out or maybe they staffed one of the offices that you opened up. And after a couple of years, you say, you know what? I'll sell them this office and they can be independent, or maybe you'll make them a partner. So there's different types of associates for different kinds of purposes, right? I want to talk for a minute about the impact of associates on practice value and the timing of valuations. And basically, it's really based on your transition timeline as far as practice value impact. And by that, I mean is this. If an associate is on a partner track or purchase track, usually we don't see a major impact on practice value because typically, the timeline of that associate with you is not very long term. It might be for 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 years. But suffice it to say, what most associates do not like is if they come into your practice and you say, well, you'll work for me for 3 years, then we'll do a partnership. Well, or maybe a purchase. But I'm going to wait and I'll sell you the practice or let you become my partner in 3 years, but we're going to value the practice in the future. For many associates, that's a big turnoff, because they or their advisors will say, well, if you help Dr. Snyder go from 1 million to 1.8 million in 3 years, and now they're going to value the practice as a $1.8 million practice, yes, you did get compensated and you got compensated fairly, but now you have to pay for all that growth in a future value. So that can be a problem. On the flip side, if in your plan you're not interested in equity transfer, really your goal is to retain quality associates. They're an employee. They're not an entrepreneur. Their characteristics are such they're not an entrepreneur. And the good news is, from the statistics I just shared with you a few minutes ago, there is more of those out there than less of them. So that's a good thing for you. So, particularly if you're a younger practitioner with multiple office ambitions or already have them, you're just letting them work for you. And then at some point, when there is a transition, typically it's not that doctor. It may be, could be a DSO, could be a large group practice, but you can then see how your value can significantly increase because there's no pressure for them to worry about whether they're contributing to growth because they're not interested in an equity position. Let's talk about something that I see probably once a month, where I do a lot of the partnerships in our company, and I get into situations where a doctor's been an associate for 6, 7 years. Now it's time to become a partner, and then I ask the question: has a baseline practice valuation ever been prepared? And of course, the answer is no. So now we've got to do a valuation, and all of a sudden, you know, that we have a problem. And what's the problem? Well, we have a current valuation prepared, and now this associate says, "Gee, I really helped you grow this practice, and I want some consideration." So it's a negotiable item. If you really want this person to become your partner, we've used what we call production credits. So we look at the associate's contribution to the practice over the last couple of years, and we make a credit to the practice. And usually it's a 2 to 3 year period. We look at their collected production. And then what we can do is offer a goodwill adjustment, because a practice value consists of two asset classes: tangible assets, your equipment, technology, leaseholds if you're a tenant, and of course the intangible assets, which predominantly is goodwill. So if there's a buy-in in the future and we have an associate who's been there for 6, 7 years, well, then we'll make some kind of adjustment to the goodwill portion of the value as recognition of the growth. Because remember, when they were working for you, they were earning a good income. So quite frankly, there's no right or wrong way to this. It's just something you may have to factor in if you get into negotiations with someone like that. So at the end of the day, we still believe in establishing a baseline valuation, and particularly due to COVID-19's impact on revenues this year, we have recommended and still are that you create a baseline value as of December 31, 2019. And so, based on your timeline, if you're looking at a transition in the next, 1 to 2 years, well, at least you have a baseline value. And of course, a new value can be done in the future, and we can see if, in fact, that value is greater or less than what it was in the baseline. So, at least, if there has to be some negotiation, we feel that having something firm and solid when everything was normal is good for everybody. Now, what we typically do when we do deferred buy-ins, we create this baseline value, and instead of increasing the price because the associate's been there a couple of years, what we'll do is we'll update the baseline value by referring to the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator. And if you go to the website bls.gov, on the home page it says calculators. It's a neat little tool where you basically pick a year, plug in an amount of money, whatever amount of money you want, hit calculate, and it'll tell you what that amount of money is worth today. Usually 1 month. Right now, if you did it today, you would get a calculation through July 31st. So we use that a lot for deferred transitions, and most people think that's a very fair way. The other reason we like to create a baseline value for a shorter term transition is because, quite frankly, if I bring an associate in and they're going to work really hard and they're going to earn a commission and make money, and the practice grows, you remember we said most of them don't want to pay for their growth. But the good news is, if you give them the baseline with this inflation adjustment, you should be able to make money because, as you'll see in a few minutes, you should be able to make a profit margin on an associate. So, in a sense, you've taken off all the constraints from this associate to work as hard as they can, but you're not giving up a future value. You're making current increase in net profit. And I have seen this time in and time out when I look at these doctors who've come in and look at values where they were, where they are. I see the doctor's net profit as the owner always increases pretty substantially. So that's just something to think about when you're creating a transition plan with your associate. So let's talk about why hire an associate. It's about time and money. From a personal viewpoint, many of you who've been in practice working hard, and particularly now with COVID and everything else that's happened, some of you obviously are thinking about getting out sooner than later. Others may just want to enjoy life a little bit more and reduce your workload and enhance the quality of your life. And for some, obviously, many, especially many solo practitioners, are looking at an associate for a transition plan and maybe even accelerate it. There's obvious business reasons why you hire an associate. Clearly, if you have an underutilized facility, that is really a primary reason to bring an associate in. You can extend additional hours. And many doctors have said, well, I'm getting up in years. I want to cut back. So they cut back. They don't they let their practice kind of begin to go in a negative direction when they still have the patients. They're just tired. Well, why do that? Why not recruit an associate, even if it's a part-time associate? Why give up those hours? And even if that doctor may not be your candidate, keep your practice at a reasonable level and don't have it decline. So associates can help counteract that. Obviously, another reason to bring an associate in, if you're trying to increase production, you want to hopefully increase future value, and you'd like to make some money along the way. And for a number of good reasons, bringing an associate in cases where you're referring a lot of things out to your local specialist, that's something to consider to maybe keep some of those services in practice. And for those of you who are into multiple office ownership, which is becoming more and more commonplace, associate recruitment and staffing is key. One of the big challenges a lot of DSOs have is when they lose their key doctor whose practice they bought, when they retire, they may have to find two doctors to take over a highly productive former owner. And if they don't stay, they have to get more. So multiple office staffing is a big challenge and for lots of different reasons. And of course, for those of you who aren't looking at immediate transitioning, clearly associates are going to enhance practice value for a future transition. So, what are some of the things to consider before hiring that first associate? And I'm sure there's lots of questions swimming around in your head. I'm not covering them all tonight because we only have an hour or so together. But the first question that I would always ask is, what's the size of your patient base? Do you have enough patients to bring an associate in? And got to remember, an associate doesn't always have to be full time. An associate can be part time. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I referenced this a minute ago that, looking at what you refer out, can your services be expanded? Can you find an individual who has clinical training and experience in services that, for example, endodontics is a classic one that could be expanded and retained in-house. What about the team? Will the staff be happy with the new person? You've been out there 25 years and you've been the doctor. You've been the patient's only doctor. Will they accept a new doctor? Probably will if it's done properly. Will your production be affected? Well, it depends on the size of your practice. If you have a smaller practice and you want to bring an associate in, chances are there could be competition for production. There's not enough to go around. So that has to be analyzed. Your facility is obviously a big constraint because if you have a 3-chair facility and you have no room for expansion, that makes scheduling extremely critical. Extended hours, it's more of a challenge as opposed to 5, 6, 7 treatment rooms. Things are not as complicated. Another thing, must I hire additional staff? We need a dental assistant for that associate. Do we need another administrator? Will we need more part-time hygienists if we reactivate patients? And finally, how much time must I invest? Well, if you're really thinking of doing it right, and we'll talk about this shortly, you have to spend some time. You just can't bring someone in and have them do dentistry. Of course, you can, but if this person particularly is going to be a transition candidate, and usually it's in a partnership track where this becomes critical, you've got to spend time with them. So if they become your partner, they'll be a good partner. Let's look at some numbers now because we've talked more concept. Let's drill down a little bit. We call saturation. Saturation definition has been out there for a long time. It's when you're working at optimum speed and your schedule is full. You have a high rate of exams and a high treatment inventory and patient acceptance too, but your inventory keeps growing because you're busy, and you're so busy that you're booked out 6 weeks in advance. It could be 4 weeks. It used to be 8 weeks. It really depends on the type of practice that you have, the services you provide, how you schedule, et cetera, use of treatment rooms. But nonetheless, you're busy. And if you're a general practitioner and you have a recare program, your hygienists are booked out for many, many months. It's really hard to get in. I just talked to one of my colleagues this morning who decided to cancel her recare exam last month because she was a little bit timid to go back into her doctor, and she wanted to go back in, and they said, "See you in November, right before Thanksgiving." So you know what I'm talking about, but those are signs that you need to take a look at. However, we now have to talk about COVID and what that is doing to our profession. So we have to factor in that some of the numbers that I used to recommend are no longer valid, at least this year and maybe next year. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we're looking at a general practice, historically we used to say that if you were treating like on a 4.5 day work week, 1,100 to 1,200 patients, maybe 1,300, you probably were a pretty busy doctor. But now, because of the decrease in capacity of about 25%, just from a planning purpose, these are not absolute numbers, these are guidelines because everybody's different, okay? But those numbers obviously have to be lower. So now we're looking at 900 to 1,000. And the revenue is still around 800,000. As you recall, the billing rate was about 777. And again, that revenue number is dependent on what as well? Not just patients, but your fee schedule. Where are you located? If you're in a market where fees are lower, those numbers are different than in markets where fees are typically higher. So we have to take that into consideration. There are no absolutes on that target number. So let's try to figure out how you're going to bring an associate in. How many days do you need the associate for? So first thing you need to do is take a look at your practice calendar. And you say to yourself, okay, I'm bringing in my first associate. I'm working 4.5 days a week, and I want to make some changes. I want to reduce my clinical schedule. I want to take 3-day weekends. I don't want to work as hard. And that's cool because if you've been doing it for a while, you deserve it. Let the next generation of doctors who are going to be your replacement eventually do that in concert and have that practice open more hours and give you more time off. Again, when you look at your calendar, you've got to think about the fact that how many patients you treated pre-COVID is not what you're treating post-COVID. So that magical 25% or so needs to be factored in. So that helps you then say, okay, if that's the case, how many patients can I handle myself, depending on my calendar? So that's why you have to know what your calendar is. How many days a week you're going to work? You're going to take an extra 2 weeks off on vacation because now you have your first associate. All these kinds of things, I'm sure, swim around in your head, but you have to factor them in. So once you determine your patient base size, you subtract this number from the total number of patients that are in your patient base by looking at your computer. Some people use 18 months as a definition of active patient. Some folks use 24 months. So whatever your definition is, you've got to figure out what your active patient base is. And then from that, and we'll see this in a minute from an example, we deduct the size of the patient base that you can reasonably treat in the days that you want to work. And that way, then you can figure out the number of days the associate can be supported because not everybody has a big enough patient base, and particularly now, to bring in a full-time associate. So even a part-time associate is clearly better than no associate at all. And then this will help you figure the number of patients that need to be transferred. So now another change from those of you who may have seen my articles or heard me speak in the past. We used to use 200 to 250. Now we're using 180 to 220, again, because of the capacity issue, meaning for every 180 to 220 patients, that equals one associate day per week. So let's have a concrete example. Let's assume that your active patient base is 1,800. And now, after you've looked at your calendar and what you plan to work with next year, your patient pool is 1,000. So now you've got 800 patients left. So based on the skill and experience of that associate, that's either 3 or 4 associate days. So as you recall, I used the number 180 to 220 because 180 may be for a recent grad, 220 someone who's finished GPR, maybe was in the military, maybe worked in a group practice, maybe it could even be higher based on their capabilities. So again, remember the numbers aren't absolute. I'm trying to give you concepts and guidelines to help you make decisions. Now, there's some non-quantitative things that have to be looked at when you're considering the hiring of an associate. First of all, what are you looking for? Obviously, number one, first and foremost, someone who's got good clinical skills. Secondly, hopefully they're a good listener because a good listener is a good case presenter and has the ability to get patients to accept treatment. Are they mature? How do they perform in front of staff as well as patients? Do they have a positive self-image? How about their appearance? Are they creative? Particularly many young doctors, because their experience, they've grown up with computers and social media. based on how you're marketing your practice, they could be very valuable allies to you in building your practice. Do they have leadership qualities? If your associate is going to be a long-term employee, that's not as critical. But if your associate is going to be your partner, you better believe that that is an important quality you should be looking for or hoping to maybe nurture. Do they have good verbal skills? You're looking for someone to provide services that you typically refer out. And you may want to look at their historical production record if they have a work history, so to speak. Do they have an ability and willingness to attract new patients? Sometimes in practices that have an overabundance of patients, we find that not to be true. That doctors sit back and they're busy. They don't need to think about new sources of patients. But again, depending on what you're looking for with the kind of track that you have with your associate, that may or may not be a big item. And of course, again, based on the employee track, is this an employee candidate or an entrepreneur? And finally, is it economically feasible? Hey, let's look for a minute. Why do associateships fail? Well, there are failures out there. Maybe some of you have gone through them. Do we have incompatible clinical philosophies, unclear expectations on the part of the associate in terms of compensation and advancement in the practice? Does the associate think he or she knows more than you? We've seen that happen before. Staff is not coached properly in the patient transfer, so it's not a good situation. And worse than that, no marketing plan has been created. The poor associates not even on the website yet, and they've been there for a year. How many times have I heard that? Sometimes we have young doctors who, like to march to a different drummer. That may or may not be acceptable to you because if they're unwilling to adapt to practice policies, that could be problematic. Do they have unrealistic income expectations? Maybe you didn't have a good enough conversation about the economics in the interview. Another reason why associateships fail is lack of frequent communication. And where we see this happening is in situations where the associate's not in the practice the days that you are. You're using that associate to fill in time. Let's say you don't work on Fridays anymore and you don't work Saturday mornings. And let's say you don't work Wednesday afternoon and you have a facility and a patient base that doesn't warrant a full-time person. So you plug this person in the days you're not there. Well, it wouldn't surprise me, depending on what goes on, that might not be a success. So let's talk a little bit about numbers for a second. I mean, obviously, you're making it a commitment, particularly if this is your first time associate. You want to make sure it works for them and for you. So let's assume we have a practice and we set a daily goal of $1,500 and we plan to have this associate work for 200 days. So our goal for the associate's 400,000. We're collecting 98% of net production. So we want that associate to collect 392,800. We have to hire a dental assistant. We have lab expense at 5%, dental supply at 7%, office expense at 2%. We have to hire a part-time administrator. We have to give the health insurance to the associate at $5,000 a year, and we're going to provide some CE at $3,000 a year. So we're going to pay the associate 33%. So now they're going to earn $132,000. And we have to pay payroll taxes because they are going to be an employee. So that's another $10,100. We give them the health insurance, give them the CE. We have staff costs, including payroll taxes, of just about $63,000. The lab expense, $11,008 at 3%. That's a practice that has CAD/CAM. It could be higher if we have more of a lab outsourced lab situation, but in this case, we use that as an example. Dental supplies at 6%, office expense at 2%. So direct expenses were just about $260,000. Well, we estimated the collections of this associate to be about $393,000. We have direct expenses of $259,000, so you would expect to make about $133,000 for a profit margin of 34%. Bottom line is, if we can't get a 33% profit margin doing it this way, then something has to be re-examined. We're not, as you saw my example, I'm not cost allocating treatment rooms or anything else. I'm looking at marginal cost, right? Marginal cost is variable expenses of the associate and the additional staff needed to support that individual. And that's how you look at your profit margin. So now we've recruited our associate, they're in the door, and we want to get started. And one of the first things in the general practice is that if that practice is saturated, typically there's a huge hygiene backlog. And that's one of the first things that a new associate can do is get involved in the reactivation process. Now, things have changed. As I mentioned before, there are hygiene shortages in certain markets. So now, when an associate comes in, it may well be that there'll be more involvement by that associate in not only a patient reactivation, but maybe doing continuing hygiene for a period of time until a new hygienist can be recruited. Before COVID, when we didn't have this issue, usually we'd recommend a number of patients go to the new associate for reactivation, and then eventually they would transfer over to the hygienist. But be that as it may, whether there is a hygienist to refer to in the future after the reactivation visit or not, it's a great way to know the patient. It's probably the least traumatic way to get to know a patient. Plus, the associate doctor has a little more time to chat with that patient to get to know them. And of course, if there are some services that need to be done, either they can be done that day based on schedule or can be scheduled with the new doctor. We also believe, especially with younger doctors, this is particularly true, not so much maybe with experienced folks, but for new doctors, we think it's a good idea to assign your best assistant for at least 1 month, maybe more, based on their background and training, and then maybe on a part-time basis for 1 or 2 months. And we do that for a couple of reasons. We want that new assistant, your best assistant, to kind of review the patient management skills of that new doctor, just to make sure everything is being done the way you want it done. Are there any observations, either positive or negative, that that top assistant of yours can give you to help make this person better if there are issues? Other reason is we want to ensure that office procedures become consistent in terms of record keeping, instrument utilization, all the other things that have to be adhered to, PPE requirements, et cetera, OSHA, you name it. That's what a top assistant can make sure that young doctor gets grounded in. We also recommend strongly, particularly if you have a full-time associate, and full-time could be 3 days a week. It doesn't have to be technically four, but 3 days is enough, in my opinion, to warrant a weekly meeting. To do what? Discuss cases and treatment protocols. And again, it depends on the skill and ability of that associate. The younger and less experienced the doctor, the more critical these weekly meetings become, particularly in the area of patient scheduling. Because if the staff are using the same time units that they use for you, that could be a big problem for a younger doctor. And that's why they're always running behind. So that becomes a problem. So you can really deal with that and intervene real soon by finding it out in the first couple of weeks if that's a problem. And again, making sure those time units are realistic. For younger doctors, particularly, and based on the kind of service mix that you have, mentoring can make a big difference. And working with this doctor, teaching them new skills, giving them hints on case presentation and treatment planning, and all that kind of good stuff, mentoring is a big deal. And for many doctors, based on the type of services they provide and the experience of that younger doctor, over the shoulder training is another key component where they basically take the place of the assistant and really observe, maybe do some limited work on that patient. So those are things that the weekly meeting is going to uncover and talk about. On a monthly basis, it's more of a business meeting where if the associate's being paid on collection, you review their accounts receivable report. Still review their production reports. What's their service mix like? If they said, "Oh, I do a lot of endo," but after the first month they only did 2 endo procedures, and you're finding out that the molar endos are still being referred out, they're just doing some anteriors, then maybe they didn't give you the full story in the interview. So you can pick some things up like that, just for example. Uh, Discussing their goals and are there concerns with the staff? And, at this point, maybe based on observations, maybe you discuss additional training opportunities. So, again, for those doctors who are thinking of having a partner, if this is your first associate and this candidate is earmarked as a partner, having those monthly meetings hopefully creates a positive habit pattern. Because one of the things that I find with partnerships that run into difficulty as they stop communicating. But hopefully you'll build a positive behavior and habit so you'll continue that if that person does become your partner. Let's talk money. Let's talk a little bit about associate compensation. Just to give you an idea, and I use this a lot when I show this to young dentists or dental school students, the kind of production they have to generate for them to earn the compensation that they so sorely need. So let's assume this practice writes off about 25%. So gross production at 40, collections 30, doctor gets paid 33%, $9,900 a month monthly comp, $118,000 annual comp. Let's look at the one at 54,000, 160,000. So this chart, without me reciting it, you can see it gives you an idea of the type of production that this doctor has to do for them to be able to get paid what they want to get paid and sometimes need to get paid. There's different options in compensation. Option number one, providing a base salary. And base salaries vary for GPs. This is varying locations. What's good in LA isn't necessarily good in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Things change. Economies are different. So we see a range nationwide between $90,000 to $150,000. And this information comes from Nationwide Dental Opportunities, which is a company in our division who places associates, and we really work very closely with them. For specialists, we see a range between 150 to 250. And obviously, you can see with those kind of numbers, if you're a solo practitioner who never had an associate, that's a big number to deal with, isn't it? Of course it is. And you know that you're in competition because groups can definitely offer these kinds of numbers without breaking a sweat because they have the cash flow and capital to do so. What we recommend with new associates particularly is that a base salary be guaranteed over a probationary period. So if you're offering somebody $90,000 as a GP, you offer them that salary for 3 to 6 months. And if they're doing fine, you make that guaranteed salary into a recoverable draw. Now, if you don't have the cash flow to offer as large a base, maybe you can offer a lower base and then mix in with a percentage of net production or collections over a baseline so that if they are productive, they'll make a little more money. So it's a way to offset cash flow stress if it's a problem. Commission and no guarantee, basically that's a draw. And that's usually what happens to most associates after the guarantee period. They may be getting the same amount of salary you guaranteed them, but that draw is recoverable, which means they've got to meet the requirements. And if not, that draw can be adjusted downward. Many doctors are working on a part-time basis. So for GPs, we see $500 to $600 per day. Again, numbers can be lower or higher based on where you are in this country. The same thing goes for specialists, 1,000 to 1,200 per day. Again, it could be higher, usually not lower than 1,000, but again, depending where you are, we've seen them as high as 1,500. Again, who is that individual who's working in your practice? What kind of training and experience do they have? Usually on a per diem rate, there are no fringe benefits, and it's obviously ideal for part-time employment. Another way of doing it is offering a minimum daily guarantee plus a percent above the break-even point. So if you wanted to offer a lower per diem rate, not guarantee it, that's something you can consider. Now, for those of you who have long-term associates, and as I said at the outset, one of the key challenges if you want a long-term associate and you really like them is retention. So you want to make sure that you offer them some type of incentive. Just like a lot of people in corporations get bonuses, this is basically a bonus concept. So what you're going to do is you'll provide a higher commission percentage over an annual collections goal. So let's take an example. Let's assume you're paying your associate 34%. And you say to your associate, they've been there a couple of years, you know what? I'd like to keep you. I know you'd like to make more money. I can't give you 36% of every first dollar, but if you reach a goal this year of, over 500, I'm going to give you 36% between 500 and 5.25. And furthermore, if you do better than that 5.25, for every $25,000 you do over that, that band goal, up to 40% you can earn. So an associate could make a nice little income, and it's really a bonus, and it's really a way to incentivize them to help them become more productive and earn more income. Typically, with full-time associates, we see fringe benefits. I'd say half of our doctors will charge the malpractice insurance against comp, or others will offer it as a fringe benefit. Specialists, particularly, will offer malpractice as part of their package. Health insurance, usually single coverage for the doctor. Continuing education, we think, is really important. Travel expense, if you've got multiple offices, that should be factored into the occasion. For specialists, entertainment expense, and possible relocation expense if you really want to bring an associate in from another area. So as we wind down, I want to cover a couple points about associate contracts, because there is no way you should have an associate in your office without a written contract, even a part-time associate. So things should be in writing. It's for your protection and for the associate's protection. First thing I'm going to comment on is most associates are not uh, independent contractors. They are employees, particularly if they're only working in your practice and you basically have control over everything they do. Now, there are associates, usually specialists, who may have their own practice, who come into your office and provide services. Uh, there are some associates who've developed an LLC or even an S Corp who work from multiple locations. So that's a little different topic. We don't have the time to get into it, but suffice it to say, most associates have to be W 2 employees. Uh, Obviously, you want to protect your business. So you want to have a non compete. And as you may or may not know, non competes are not enforceable in all states. But if they are allowed, they have to be reasonable in terms of distance. And we typically use an 80-20 rule. So what's a reasonable distance? So I always ask my clients, okay, where do 80 to 90% of your patients come from? What zip code are they in? Obviously, this is not for downtown New York or Chicago, because patients are coming into the cities, but this is more for a, a smaller town, uh, rural area where patients are traveling. You can kind of measure that by looking at a zip code analysis, and that will help you set up the zip code restrictions. Now, restrictive covenants are local jurisdiction matters, meaning you need to make sure your attorney can look at the case law in the county or area and see what's enforceable, because it does vary geographically. That has to be reasonable. And in duration for associates is typically 1 to 2 years. Greater than 2 years in most jurisdictions is considered excessive. And so, what's the problem if you have a real tough restrictive covenant? And let's say I'm an associate for a couple of years, I leave, and you put a 5-year on me. I may want to challenge that, and I could win maybe, and that covenant could be thrown out. So there are some risks downside for you if you have unreasonable non-competes. There are some enforcement remedies that can be taken, and sometimes to avoid that, what you might want to have is some type of liquidated damages in your contract, where perhaps you can buy back the covenant if you're the associate. And this we find is an ideal strategy for associates who go to small towns and rural areas, move their family. They want to still stay there. There's ways to work that out. Another big clause for you doctors is an assignment clause. And if you're going to sell your business and you have an employee associate and there's a covenant, you want that covenant, especially if you sell the business, to be assigned to the new purchaser. Because if you sell your business and you're no longer an owner, your covenant could be null and void. So again, we've seen some transactions where doctors have lost practice value where this assignment clause was not included in their contract. Non-solicitation, no solicitation of patients and staff, set defined period of time. It has to be direct in solicitation. That means no letters, phone calls, no downloading any kind of patient lists or anything like that, not taking a stick out with all the data, the practice's data on it can't be done. What's more important, quite frankly, in non-solicitation clauses is not soliciting the staff, because quite frankly, that's where we see the biggest damage, where you lose a key hygienist, an office manager, a top assistant. We recommend liquidated damages clauses be put into our contracts for solicitation of staff. So this evening covered a lot of ground, talking about a topic that is very important to many of you, and hope that you really got some good ideas. Unfortunately, we don't have time to entertain questions, but please feel free to send us any questions that you have on transition planning, practice valuation, associate comp, you name it. We'll get back to you. One of our reps will be happy to chat with you, or you can see on the screen. You can go to our website, communicate with us that way at www.henryscheinppt.com, or our email address at ppt@henryschein.com. Or finally, if you'd like to pick up the good old telephone, call our toll-free number and we'll route you to someone to help you. That number is 800-988-5674. I mentioned to you in passing that one of our colleagues, Ms. Cindy Bickers, who's our national manager of Nationwide Dental Opportunities, her group is happy to assist you in helping you recruit an associate, uh, either a specialist or GP, either full time or part time. So if you've been struggling or you don't want to spend the time and effort to do it yourself, please give her a call. And you can see on the screen that she can be reached at ndo@henryschein.com, or calling our office at 866-409-3001. And in closing, this is an offer that I made in our first two programs. We've actually extended our deadline to September 30th. It was July 31. We've had so much positive feedback. And so the offer is simply this. If you order a paid baseline valuation, which is going to run through the end of 2019, you order it by September 30th, we will prepare a complimentary practice valuation update for the year 2020. And obviously, we won't be doing that till 2021 till we get your financial data. But you'd have to order a valuation and pay the fee, and we'll provide a complimentary valuation. So again, I want to thank you all for taking the time this evening to join me on this very important topic. And I wish you well, and enjoy the upcoming Labor Day holiday and the remainder of summer. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Tom, for the insightful presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's webinar. If you have questions that we were unable to answer during the presentation, please email us at ppt@henryschein.com. Everyone attending will receive a link to view the recording of the presentation in the coming week via email. On behalf of Henry Schein Dental Business Institute, thank you for attending. Have a great night.